Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining or taking the time to join us today. We're excited to have you on this session focused on the latest features, capabilities, and updates around HP SitePrint. Um, my name is Chris Dysart. I'll be kicking you off today. I'm the sales manager for BuildingPoint SouthEast, and I'll do some introductions for the people on the call. Again, I'm the sales manager for BuildingPoint SouthEast. We also have Ryan Pastor, who's going to be leading the bulk of today's presentation. He is the director of emerging technologies for us. We have David Redman, who's the owner and operator of Redman Robotics. He's going to bring some real world applications and field experience. And then we have Alex Devernois from HP. He's going to be available for helping answer questions and thoughts throughout the session and at the end. Quick housekeeping item: if there are any Q&A, any questions during the presentation, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to drop any questions in there. Alex will answer them throughout, or we'll address them at the end. A little about BuildingPoint SouthEast. If you don't know who we are or you're not familiar with us, we're the Trimble distribution and HP distribution partner focused on construction technology solutions. We work with general contractors, specialty trades, VDC teams to help bridge the gap between a digital model and the field. This includes layout, scanning, mixed reality, robotics, and workflows that improve your accuracy, speed, and overall project efficiency. A big part of what we do is not just provide the technology, but is help implement the technology through training, service, and just support. And that actually gets you the ROI faster. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Ryan to walk us through what today's content is and drive the rest in the latest of HP SitePrint. Ryan?
Awesome. Appreciate it, Chris. Welcome, everybody. I hope you'll get a lot out of the webinar. So overall, we're going to be kind of presenting kind of a broad overview of where we've been with HP SitePrint and about the past 3 or so years as an authorized distributor. And then, like Chris mentioned, we're going to kind of have an interview with Redman Robotics to go over kind of some more, rubber hitting the road, if you will. So, but by the numbers, HP SitePrint, over the years so far has had over 500 projects, over 300 plus units shipped just here in the U.S., and then 150 million square footage of usage. So this is something that's continually growing. It's not a fad. It's not something that's going away. So hopefully you'll be able to kind of see that throughout today's presentation. So this is a kind of a good snapshot timeline that shows overarching the 3 years of acceleration that we've been through with HP. So whether you're a new customer and none of this kind of makes sense or matters, but if you're not yet in the solution, maybe you've seen it kind of over the years, at one of these points. But we all know technology is ever kind of speeding to increase and improve, right? So this slide kind of shows all the improvements that we've had in just a 3-year span of time, right? So at the launch, we had the RTS 573 compatibility in the AutoCAD plugin, and then you can kind of see wherever you see VP or value pack, that essentially just means new features, fixes, things like that. What you would traditionally see as a software upgrade, in the robotics realm, technically it's called a firmware update. So but that just means it's getting better, right? So you can see along the line we added the Revit plugin, and then we added total station compatibility as well, that we'll get into in a little bit here. So the first kind of category that we wanted to go through, probably the most important, is the speed and printing efficiencies. So the navigation of the robot obviously is kind of the premier importance, right? So went really from this moving kind of robotic, think 90s, robot, very kind of structured movements, turn forward, backward, and then in VP 2.0, we really went to a more efficient pathing, improved trajectory and turnings, and what we call landings, to get to the accuracy that we desire, right? So the overall kind of navigation of the robot significantly improved in VP 2.0, where we saw huge efficiency gains. And that wasn't even from the robot rolling faster, right? That was just from improving the algorithm for the navigation as well. So but speaking of rolling speeds, in VP 3.0, we did have the turbo upgrade package that was more of a physical improvement, right? So but one of the great things there was we didn't have to go through and return, kind of sell a whole new robot to somebody, buy back old robots. It was really, everything inside of the robot is very modular. So this was a, physical update that we could install that improve the improve the sensor package, which we call the smart navigation system, that allowed the robot to, kind of more clearly see the world, right? I think similar to, self-driving cars and things like that. So very similar to that, being able to dodge things that are in the way in real time, and other things. So in VP 3.2, we got 50% faster point and text printing, right? So that's hugely important for our MEP customers that are just looking to kind of replace their current workflow and do it much faster. So we improved what that looks like. And then in 4.1, there was 30% productivity increase just from the logic again, right? So, kind of at every turn, HP has been improving, what is the navigation of the robot look like? How can, whether it's the physical rolling speed, which was essentially doubled in 3.0, all the way down to essentially just the software behind the the brains behind the operation. So and then throughout we kind of saw reduced retries on the landings, and better alignment, faster kind of stops, to keep the robot rolling. So what does this mean for your job site, right? So more layout per day, obviously that is the goal. Less time on site. So obviously most of the time layout is on the critical path. You can't install something until you know where it goes, right? So and there's usually a limited amount of time, and people that are pushing the schedule really want to get the work in place as efficiently as possible, right? So the efficiencies that have been gained through SitePrint on countless projects have saved not just time but also money as well. So less idle time. The more the robot is moving, the more efficient that it is, right? It's just kind of like any other worker, right? If your worker is taking breaks and doing this and that, then essentially productivity is not happening. So the robot, the more we can keep the robot moving, the more efficiently that you're going to get that project completed. So and then less rework from missed and duplicate prints. So we'll kind of go through a few of the workflow things in this next section here. So just obviously, the user experience is of utmost importance as well. One of the pillars of HP SitePrint is that it's easy to use. So it's been like that from the beginning, but they've made it even easier and listen to customer feedback, right? To make sure that things are, getting implemented, and, they're not developing kind of in a vacuum, but giving the people what they want. So a few of the workflow efficiencies, focusing on less kind of preparation, and more time printing, right? So in VP 2.2, we allowed the creation of control points in the UI, right? So it used to be that you were able to do that in the CAD file, but a lot of times we know, you kind of things have to happen in the field. You have to make adjustments. So they, kind of the earlier days of SitePrint, they focused a lot on, kind of getting more versatility in the field, through the UI, the user interface. That's what we call kind of when you're holding the tablet, right? So, and then in 3.1, kind of furthered that. 2.2, we essentially were able to type in control point values, which was really helpful for people that already knew that total station workflow. And then 3.1, we were able to take in a CSV to make that process even more efficient. So also in 3.1, we were able to now create offsets directly in the UI because one of the physical limitations of the robot is we can't print within 8 inches of an obstacle, whether that's a column or a slab edge. We used to be able to do the offset directly in the CAD file, but we all know sometimes things look different on site. Things aren't in exactly the right spot of the CAD. You might have to add an obstacle and then create an offset. So being able to create that offset in the UI has tremendously helped customers to get markings still on the ground, but keep on going. Another feature that was added was multi-layer printing. This really helped customers that wanted to maybe do multi-trade layout and say, hey, let's get all the drywall track down on the ground first, and then come back and do kind of intermittent points or other text for MEPs or steel overhead, things like that, right? So another application there is multicolor printing. So if you want to have your red layer, and then go and switch over to your black, you can have those on different layers now, which is hugely efficient. So in 3.2, we added progress reports, not just a CSV report, but also back in the cloud, kind of in the home office side, right? Project managers are now able to see almost to what to the effect almost in live time of what the operator is seeing in the field. So they can see, hey, is this project going on track or are we falling behind? So in 4.0, we added floor level deviation marking. So that started to add the excuse me, started to add the ability to not just lay out some data, but to collect the data as well. So when SitePrint goes over a point, we now have the ability to collect the elevation of that specific point, do that for a certain area, and then while we're live in the tablet, robot's still on, we can pick the highest point, median point, lowest point, compare it to a CAD file elevation, and get whatever deviation we need, and then turn those into printable elements and turn right back around within minutes and print the deviation from a specific spot in the field, which is great for kind of racking anywhere where you might have equipment feet, things like that, anywhere where you're using shimming, great applications there. We also improved the smarter job execution, so reducing human errors and inefficiencies. The accuracy dashboard in 2.2 really helped us help the end user see if all the things they were doing were going to lead to a good print. And then 3.2, this was another big one for our RTS users that were used to seeing resection residuals, right? Because we always say as long as you have a good CAD file and tight control, the SitePrint is a robot. It's going to do what it does, right? So the being able to see the residuals of the resection from the total, of what the total station shot, to make sure that the control network is tight, is a huge kind of factor of layout. So that was a big upgrade. And then in 3.0 and 4.1. We added shadowing, which you see there on the right-hand side. This allows us to, print more in kind of an area, from one total station setup and make it more clear, not get of what can be printed, right? To not get stuck behind obstacles like columns that you see in that photo there. We were able to, essentially trim inside the shadow now. So if you had a long line that was on the other side of some columns, now you can essentially just trim those instead of previously it would be completely discarded. So great improvements there. So, and then along the way we had automatic diagnostics and cloud uploads, which really help with the kind of if there is an issue on site, contact us as, your support side. And then if needed, we can, get HP involved and really tap into the robot, in real time to make sure that, we get issues resolved in a very timely manner. So the last section we'll talk about is the Trimble integration. So, reducing your overall investment. We know, HP is an investment. We know that there's return on that investment. We'll go over that here in a second with some case studies. But, in 3.0, we added the S9 compatibility, which is more of a geospatial gun, but it does add the ability. It was a 1-second gun, which, kind of came more to fruition in 4.1 there, which we'll get to in a second. But it also added the integrated radio module, right? We used to have, you see that photo in the center there, that black piece on the back. It was just another thing to charge. And Trimble ended up actually discontinuing it. So HP kind of picked up the slack there and said, okay, let's make this something for the Trimble users that we can communicate or, integrate directly into the robot. So that's now kind of standard issue, part of the package. And then in 2.1 and 3.1, we had in 3.2 just different prism kind of improvements, right? So you can add a custom prism, improving tracking during the prism setup, detecting a wrong prism or robot slippage, if the prism, if the laser got tied onto something else, things like that. So, and then the spherical prism kind of got added in 4.1 when the Trimble RI came out as well. So really leaning into, making more total stations compatible, but also, the spherical prism allowed us to not only, kind of get from an 1/8 inch down to a 16th inch, with high accuracy mode, but allowed us to improve, tracking and things like that. So what is HP enabled with SitePrint? These are a few case studies. We won't kind of go into them. There's kind of a whole website on these case studies if you want to dive into it a little bit more. But just showing kind of some different applications. Whether it's a GC doing multi-trade layout, or just a drywall company or racking, as you see there on the right side. So a lot of different applications and efficiencies, that have allowed, quicker layout, at a reduced cost. So, but these are all kind of examples that are, kind of from around the world. But today we want to bring a more local case study. Redman Robotics, based out of the Atlanta area. David Redman is here, turned his video on there. So we're going to kind of do a little kind of interview just to see, what they've seen. So David was essentially kind of part of one of the first users that we had, right? So he came kind of searching us out. And, so maybe we'll start with that. I guess, David, what made you kind of decide to invest in SitePrint, and how did you kind of build your business kind of from scratch? I think you said you were in the construction industry before, but really didn't know CAD or didn't know layout too much. So, kind of what was it about HP SitePrint that, really made you piqued your interest?
Well, thanks, Ryan, and the team from BuildingPoint. It's an honor to be with you and participating. To let you know how we got into this, or I got into this. I was at a Bible study with an architect friend of mine. He led it, and I asked him a question one day: "What is artificial intelligence going to do to the construction industry or to his business as an architect?" And he didn't really have an answer. And he asked me what I thought, and I gave him some opinions. And I said, well, mostly it's going to change it. And then I began to ask that question for myself. And so I went to the Google thing there and entered in construction and robotics. And lo and behold, HP SitePrint popped up. And it's like, well, here's a printer, and I know that HP is good at printing, And now it's running around on the floor printing out layout. And something clicked, and I said, this is something I can do. This is something that I want to be a part of. It's a new emerging technology in construction. The problems are endless to solve. This is a good challenge and a great way for me to be able to finish my career. And so I sought out the guys at BuildingPoint SouthEast and purchased a robot and began to learn how to use a total station, learn how to use a robot, and didn't really know what a user interface was. I figured that out, and then we learned what CAD was. I knew what CAD was. I've done some, worked in some drawing programs before, but really didn't have the experience. But I knew that, and those are all components that need to be learned and present barriers to a lot of end users. And so I thought, well, this technology is going to be really good as a service. And so we developed a service model around the HP SitePrint and have been doing layout for about a couple of years now. Some of the projects that we were on or have been on were, our first one was with Holder Construction, and we worked at the Trilliff Live Studios, a television studio build that was 300,000 square feet of nothing but curves and soffits, and a pretty good challenge, because not only did the tradespeople that were there not know the best place for SitePrint to be, which isn't necessarily where traditional layout or drywall layout is. It's really, as soon as a slab is poured, is when is the best use for it. And so we had to negotiate that, and other problems that came along. And then we moved on to printing, doing some stuff for Amazon. We managed to score a job in St. Thomas. That was really, really tough work. And we printed a hotel there. And, we've just been learning along the way and developing the skills set that is needed to really make this robot a really good fit for service and for layout in general. I've done layout before in the construction business that I've had. My first instrument was a Berger line sight, and I shot in slabs and things like that. So it's not as if I came totally unaware of how to do layout, but I certainly didn't have the high tech robotics and the CAD talents that are required for this technology.
Yeah, for sure. And the other pictures we have here on the screen, I know you said you've done big projects as well, but you've also done smaller ones, right? With
Sure.
kind of these high-end retailers, maybe, because that's a big misconception. People think, oh, I have to have this massive project, but it can be used in smaller applications as well, right?
Yeah, most definitely. The picture you see at the bottom is a layout we did in Nashville for Hermes. A lot of curves. If you've ever been in the store and bought something, then you're probably not on this webinar. But if you've ever been in the store, you can see just the incredible amount of design that goes into lighting, presentation, the curves, the soffit, and things. And so they called us up and said that we'd like for you to lay this out. And so we did. We got the CAD file, loaded it in the robot, and you can see there just how complicated it is. A couple of other retails we did was Hira's jewelry store in Buckhead in Atlanta, and then we did another Cartier's in Chicago, and the Hermes in Chicago. Cartier's was a job we did in Austin, and so. Yeah, and the small side end of things, there's where there's curves, there's need for a robot. That's for sure.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's obviously taking a curve. If anybody's tried to lay out a curve, there's a radius point and all that. So yeah, for sure. Being able to just print directly from the CAD file is a
Yeah.
huge time savings for customers there.
Yeah.
So switching gears a little bit, maybe talk about kind of the relationship between Redman Robotics, and us, BuildingPoint. You guys were basically knocking on our door before we even had a unit to offer, right? So you were sold on it, before we even kind of had it. So from that, to where we are now, maybe talk about kind of our relationship, so that other people can kind of see the benefit of potentially purchasing through us.
Yeah, for sure. A lot of it's been an honor to be a part of a team, and that's what it's taken between Building Point, Hewlett Packard, and Redman Robotics to execute projects. And whether it is uh, a duh question about how to use a CAD or how to place a point in the UI, or some really technical questions about why is this robot not running correctly. Um, all those questions have been melded into the robot in each iteration. One example has been we noticed, and I'm sure other people noticed, that when we did resections, there were Z values that were there, and that the robot could take a Z value. And I had an associate suggest that we should offer the Z values as a value add. And then, a couple of months later, 6 months, 9 months, we saw the floor leveling product come out. And we were able to use that in Thailand at a Google data center. And that center was 10,000 square meters of nothing but points and plates to lay out for racking for servers. And one of the key elements that we were able to deliver them was for each particular rack, where was the highest point, so they could begin their shimming process from there and shim downwards and make sure that their installation was level. So all along the way, we've been able to see the results of the teamwork and just the problem solving that's going on. It's been great to watch and an honor to be a part of.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I know you mentioned Thailand, St. Thomas, Chicago. Is there anywhere that you guys won't go? I know.
Well, yeah, no, there's not at the moment. If somebody calls and there's a spot on the schedule, we're on a plane or a bus or a boat and headed that direction. And in fact, I'm in Orlando on a print this week for a residential, and the problems in residential are the CAD drawings are there, but once you go through the submittal process and the drywall company's laid out a couple of projects or apartments, there's a lot of changes and that need to be made in the CAD to deliver a print. And so we're working out the logistics of that so that they can adopt the technology and bring it in. And so that's just, it's an exciting part of this industry right now. I'm sure as we go on and more robots come along, it'll be more localized. But for now, it's a good time to be to own a robot and travel.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think we're running a little bit low on time, so I just want to make sure that we have time for a little bit of question and answer. So we'll kind of transition into the question and answer phase. We'll invite Alex to kind of pop in. He's been monitoring the chat and questions to see if there's anything that people want to hear about next.
All right, thanks, Ryan. Yes, we have a couple of pre-submitted questions here. So this would be for both you, Ryan, and David. What type of applications do you see the HP SitePrint used on most often? And also, does the project have to be a certain size to make sense? So I guess, Ryan, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think what we've been seeing a lot of is actually in kind of contrary to what we initially thought, is kind of general contractors, right? So traditionally, GCs kind of shuck a lot of risk off of themselves and don't want to take that risk. But the HP product is actually one that is changing that workflow, because most GCs are doing some sort of coordination, and they're already, kind of owning the schedule, and the control network. So, we're actually seeing a lot of success with GCs that, kind of really understand that. And, traditionally where they weren't able to take on that risk, and just, logistically, to hire a whole survey team and all that, now they can deploy this robot and get multi-trade layout done, really quickly. So, but, not just that, but also, kind of, is there a certain size? No, not really. And that's kind of one of the beautiful things about the usage method or model of, financial side is, it makes sense for a small project or a big project. So on either one, you kind of see from the examples that David shared too is, you're going to save time kind of in any application for sure.
Yeah, one area we're seeing success is in where there is a renovation or an existing building shell. And there tends to be a lot of downtime for the building itself as the project gets moving. And so the risk for trying SitePrint and trying robotic layout is a little bit lower from the GC's perspective. They realize that between the permit phase and if it happens to already be demoed or it's just a wide open space, that's the perfect time to come in and have us do a layout. And that layout, because of the way the ink technology is, whether it's a 6-month or a year or 2-year ink, allows that layout to go down and be there when the tradesmen need it. That's really key. It's not just chalk and spray going down. It's ink, and it's permanent, or as permanent as you'd like for it to be.
Awesome. Thank you. And then here's a question. What's the biggest challenge that new HP SitePrint users face?
Yeah, I would say, for what we traditionally see, is most of the time it's kind of the CAD file, right? Everybody kind of knows garbage in, garbage out. And a lot of people are kind of good at BIM and CAD these days. But it's a little bit more of a, you're not editing the CAD file, but you are, you have to really be poignant about what you want to choose to get printed out, right? So, I mean, you very well could, load a huge file in there and, do all these other things, but the end goal is to make the end user's life in the field as easy as possible, right? Because, we always say it's kind of a half a person, right? The user in the field can set it up and, kind of let it run around, and you don't really need to babysit the thing anymore. It does a really good job at, once you kind of give it a good room to run and set up all your obstacles and all that, it runs really efficiently. So, that's kind of a big challenge. I guess the quote unquote biggest challenge, and through our training and support, we do a good job kind of walking people through, how does the robot think, but also, hey, what does the robot need to get started, and kind of what's the most efficient way to essentially get the most amount of information down on the floor in the least amount of CAD elements possible, right? So, I think that's kind of the most challenging, but is something that is easily overcome, with training and experience. So,
and from our side of things, we are offering it as a service to help people overcome the lack of CAD knowledge. It doesn't, because we can offer it as a service, doesn't mean that you have to know CAD inside and out. And that's just a way that we're just meeting the challenges of the market, and certainly solving those problems is a big part of what we do.
Perfect. And then lastly, I guess we'll just kind of dovetail into the closing. So how do we schedule a demo with you guys?
Yeah. So here is our kind of contact information. So you can reach directly out to us at the emails or phone numbers provided here. or obviously you can go to our website and, fill out the contact us page. It'll all kind of end up getting back to us. So yeah, you can, kind of different ways to get started. Obviously, if you want somebody else to do it, Redman is here. But on the BuildingPoint side, we also offer rentals, flex lease, purchase, financing, all the different things to help you through kind of that journey and of the emerging technology, like David mentioned earlier. So,
yeah, and we kind of are the try before you buy guys, and if we see a client and it makes sense for them to own a robot, we're going to say, you guys really need to own a robot. It'll become evident to themselves, and we're just part of that sales process of selling the technology and then helping the end customer decide what's the best model that's going to work for them. So it's good to be a part of that process.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys. We appreciate it. Perfect. So, Chris, do you want to tie everything together for us here? Or how about Ryan?
Yeah, no, we appreciate everybody's time, and just let us know how we can help. And we appreciate everybody logging in today or watching this at a later time. So appreciate it, and we'll see you next time.